Seriously?
All right, let's go ahead and get started. And we'll start with a prayer. Looks like we have half dozen or so online, another 10 or 15 here, so that's great. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Holy and loving God, we do give you thanks for another day. During this day in which we especially remember your Saint Francis, we ask you to bless all of us, to make us more and more mindful of you and your presence in creation and in one another. Ask you to bless our time around Scripture, to open our hearts and our minds that we may learn more how to follow you. We pray this in your most holy name. Amen. All right. So I know last week Father Tom was leading the conversation, and he covered, I think, everything in Nehemiah up through chapter 12 is what he told me, that we kind of tried to finish but couldn't quite finish the book. So I want to take a little time just to review what you covered last week, just if anyone has questions or comments, anything that you'd like to cover. Then I'll do chapter 13 with all of us together. Then we'll do an overview of the book of Esther. And at least do the first chapter, I think, is probably what we'll be able to get to. But any thoughts, questions about Nehemiah before we finish? Are you glad we read Nehemiah? It's Tom and I were discussing the other day. It's, you don't really read Ezra and Nehemiah too much, in the lectionary, and I think he was saying I hadn't read it too much in seminary. So, it's good to go back because they're both influential books. They're, like I said at the beginning, they're parts we don't always fully appreciate or understand, but they're very influential, especially in what we think of as Judaism today. It really helped to form that faith, and then because of that, formed our faith. But any other comments or questions? All right. We're all ready to get into Esther, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's wrap up then, and I'll do the last chapter of Nehemiah is where we are. Oh, no, that's not the one I want. There we go. All right. So what have been the big things that Nehemiah has accomplished from what you remember these first several chapters we've covered? What was the first big thing Nehemiah did?
A wall.
A wall. And why was that important?
Self-protection.
Yeah. So there had been a wall before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian Empire. And as part of the destruction, of course, because it's a fortress type city in a mountainous area, tearing down the wall was a big part of making it no longer, a defensive position and destroying the temple. So if you remember, the big part of Ezra was rebuilding first the altar, then the temple. So the second temple, it's called. And then the walls helped to secure the city once again. So that was number one. What was another big part of what Nehemiah did in chapter 5? Give you a hint about eye care. Anyone remember about the other big thing he did?
The assembly.
The assembly. And if you weren't here that week, or if you haven't read it, it's where he saw that there were people who were in charge, who had both financial and probably other types of power. And because of that, then those folks who were doing the work often were getting in debt. So they needed to get the help of the wealthy people to have what they needed to have food or and other just basic necessities. And they would get more and more into debt, and then not only owe money, but at times would then have to give their children in slavery. So that was just not a just situation. So Nehemiah called a great assembly and brought in all the officials, those people who were doing the unjust deeds, and told them to stop, basically. And the biblical language was to proclaim a jubilee, which was in the Torah, that you would forgive debts and set captives, slaves free. So he did that. And if you don't know about eye care, I can tell you later. But basically, the Nehemiah assembly we do every spring is based on that concept that you bring officials together and tell them what is where there are needed changes. And that large gathering gives you the type of power you need to get change. So that's another thing. And then today will be the third thing And I don't think we've covered it too much. So we'll just go into chapter 13 about the third thing. But you kind of remember or guess what the third thing was? Too loud? Does anyone know how to control the sound in the back? If not, I can run back there real quick. I can talk quiet. I get excited. Well, I'll get excited in a whisper.
Too well.
So just do this if I get loud again. But does anyone know what the third big thing that Nehemiah accomplished? The wall, the great assembly, and what we're going to cover today.
The ancestry notation,
Ancestry?
isn't that what it's in? Ancestry notation.
You have all those, the genealogies. That's part of the record that he uses in Ezra. It's in Ezra as well. But about what had happened as far as marriages in the country. Yeah, and why is that an issue?
Syncretism.
Say again?
Syncretism.
Okay, syncretism, which is a fancy word, means that you worship other gods, but Yahweh, right? So that and this was at least back to the time of Solomon and probably in the very first conquest of Canaan, that there were directions, don't intermarry. And the idea is that if you marry your wife, typically it was the wife, would bring their religious beliefs, and then you would have a dilution of the faith, or a syncretism, another way to say it. So we read about a similar action in Ezra that we'll talk about, but where there's actual separation of wives and children from their husbands. So it's, again, part of it that's very difficult for us, for me, I assume for all of us. So let's get started with chapter 13, unless there are any other comments. So remember, they had another gathering. They read from the law. The people said, amen, we will do what the law says. So they read from the law of Moses. And in the law, this is one of those tricky things about the Bible. I talked about in the sermon on Sunday. One part says this, another part says that, and then you have to figure out the path to follow. But in the law, they found that no Ammonite or Moabite should enter the assembly of God, because, and this is the rationale going back into the time of the Exodus, they did not meet the Israelites with bread and water, didn't show hospitality. But if you remember the story of Balaam's ass, remember that from Sunday school or earlier, they hired this prophet to curse them. And if you remember, it was kind of a joke. Every time he would try to curse them, a blessing would come out. And remember, the ass actually protected Balaam, the donkey, because of he was going along and there was this angel of the Lord who was going to kill him. And the donkey kept kind of walking away, and Balaam kept hitting the ass. And then the ass spoke and said, why are you, I'm here to help you, buddy. But anyway, so that was the rationale for not having any Moabites or Ammonites in the people. Now, what's the book of the Bible that is a counterpoint that indicates Moabites are just fine?
Ruth.
The book of Ruth, if you haven't read it, and I never remember if she's the great grandmother or grandmother of, Hutch or anyone? David, King David. So, arguably the greatest king of all the monarchy of Israel or Judah. And so, that's where, the law says a thing, but you have to always be open to what the Spirit says in addition to what the letter says. So in verse 4, now before this, the priest Eliashib, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, so he's an insider, someone responsible for worship, and who was related to Tobiah. Do you remember Tobiah? He was a bad guy, right? So he was one of the local gang that was trying to keep Nehemiah from building the wall. And so he because he was related, did him a favor. He prepared for Tobiah a large room where they had previously put the grain offering. So this was a storage room that was specially dedicated in the Lord's house, in the temple. So where they'd have offerings, frankincense, vessels, like a like a vestry area that you would keep all the things for our altar, the altar guild area, and the tithes, all the offerings, which were given. So this was a dedicated space. Verse 6, Nehemiah says, Hello,
Hello.
hello. Not sure what happened
We
there.
are gonna have to talk loud.
Now I'm back up high again. Let me see if my battery died. Bummer. Okay. Always check your battery before you speak. Sorry about that. So same rule, other direction. If you can't hear me, wave your hand. So Nehemiah is back in Persia, and I think Susa, in the capital, with King Artaxerxes. Because remember, what was his role with the king? Cupbearer, which was not only the cupbearer, and he would taste the wine and choose the wine, but also because of his proximity, he'd be a counselor to the king. So he's back visiting, I'm sure, to check in, say, hey, king, how you doing? You okay? And so while he's away, this priest brings Tobiah right into the inner courts of the temple. And so he leaves the king, verse 7, he returns to Jerusalem, and then he discovers what Eliashib has done. And so that is obviously upsetting to Nehemiah. Verse 8, I was angry and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the room. So you get this, again, kind of insight into Nehemiah's personality, his character. He's not an ivory tower leader. So he's like, okay, this stuff goes out of here. And I'm thinking he's the type guy that you don't get in his way. Okay, we'll back off. And then he gives orders. So he's not just a physical leader, but he's also obviously the commander. And they cleanse the chambers. Nehemiah wasn't going to do that, but they're scrubbing all this, the stink of Tobiah out. And then they started bringing back all the things that had been removed. So he fixes that. And then verse 10, he's just he's a leader and he's a hands-on person. He knows what's happening. But during this time, I guess while he's away, he finds that the Levites who assist the priests in the worship in the temple haven't been getting their portion. They're paid, basically, in verse 10, and also the singers. And so they had all gone back to work. They went to their fields to get food. They weren't getting what they were needing to live. So verse 11, Nehemiah remonstrated with the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And so he gathers them together to make this right, just like he had done with the other assembly. Verse 12, that he got all of Judah to bring in the tithe, so what they were needing in terms of worship, grain and wine and oil, got it back in the storehouse. And then he appointed administrators, treasurers, and others to kind of be sure things were getting, distributed appropriately. So we won't read all of that. Verse 14 is a repeated prayer from Nehemiah, basically as a footnote to, here's what I did, and then a prayer saying, remember me, oh my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I've done for the house of my God and for his service. So in his faith, he wants to be sure he is remembered. So that's you're going to hear that in prior chapters, and in this chapter, I think 3 different times. Any questions about this? This is kind of more administrative, but any thoughts about it? Right, it's a good point. Sure.
Talked about how many there were. I actually looked at them. One of them was in the 60s. That was Jesus. But anyway, the whole idea of awakening is to go back to the roots of what you believe and make sure that your actions are aligning.
Sure.
That's what Nehemiah is doing over and over.
Yeah.
The poor man, he goes away, and he comes back, and everything's kind of straightened out, gotten untangled again.
Right.
So I just wondered if that was something important to remember.
Sure. Absolutely. And when I said the reform measures, so the first thing, and then this with the intermarrying, but all of those things, including building the wall, are to protect the worship, their way of honoring Yahweh and getting their identity back. They had the identity of the exile where they as a community would, read Torah, they pray, they had those ways of staying together, but coming back into their land, how do they, it'll not be the same glory as the time of David or Solomon, but to kind of restore their space and their identity, their way of worshiping God. It's not a bad way to think of it in terms of renewal. It's a different type of renewal, I would say, than what we think of in the United States as some of the Great Awakening and so forth. But it's still, it's getting reconnected to God. Absolutely. What other thoughts or questions? Okay, we'll keep going. So another religious reform that's going to be needed is they've gotten lax about keeping Sabbath. So that is probably the greatest Jewish distinction, along with circumcision, that those are things that are uniquely Jewish that they really brought to civilization through their faith in God. And so keeping Sabbath when they're in Babylon was a harder thing to do because it wasn't the practice there. Coming back into their land, they want to be sure, or Nehemiah and others like him want to restore the Sabbath practice. And what he saw in verse 15 is it's harvest time probably. They're treading the wine presses, which I've never done. Anyone ever treaded on a wine press? I assume it's not easy work. Right? It's kind of fun the first 2 minutes, would be my thought. But it's hard work, and you're trying to obviously get the wine produced. And they're bringing in the grain, bringing in the sheaves, as the old hymn goes, loading it on the donkeys. Because remember, the Sabbath, your animals aren't supposed to work. So they're really breaking all the laws. So they're doing all of that on the Sabbath day, and then also bringing it to Jerusalem. So either to sell or to give, to the temple. And Nehemiah warns them, says, this is not right. Don't do this. Verse 16, Tyrians, always sounds like something from Star Trek, but those great traders from Tyre and what we know today as Lebanon, they also lived in the city. So, Judah and Lebanon, Tyre would often trade. And so they were bringing in fish, as you would imagine. They were a seaport, all kinds of merchandise, and again, selling on the Sabbath. And so Nehemiah goes to the nobles, to the leaders, and said, what is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your ancestors act in this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on the city? Yet you bring more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it's like, did you not learn? So, Assyria conquers the northern kingdom, Babylon conquers Judah, and at least part of the way the prophets explained it is because of not following the law, especially, idolatry and things like not keeping the Sabbath, making working people work on the Sabbath against the law. So he's saying, you're going to do the things that caused all this judgment and exile. Haven't you learned, basically? Verse 19, again, you get an insight into Nehemiah's personality. When it began to be dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut. So no more business, no more even coming in at night for setting up the next day. Everything should stop. And then he put some of his servants over the gates to prevent that from happening, any burdens being brought in. Verse 20, then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of merchandise spent the night outside. So one interpretation, at least they're not doing anything, they're just waiting outside. But by Nehemiah's account, still not the right thing. So he warns them and said to them, verse 21, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. So remember, this is a guy throwing out the furniture. So he's a, Jesus and cleansing the temple type of guy. So I imagine Nehemiah is this big guy and pretty tough. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. So they heard that. Verse 22, and I commanded the Levites, so again, these assistants for the temple, that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. So in addition to their temple duties, to be the gatekeepers. And again, he does that similar prayer. Remember this also in my favor, oh my God. And we'll just keep going. And again, Nehemiah, this is again part of the memoir. If you remember that, he is talking about all of his exploits and all that he did. So it's in the first person singular. In those days, also I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. So again, not right according to the law. And half of their children, this is often this point of contention even today, they would speak that other language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah. So not only the religious differences, but the language, the very core cultural identity. So verse 25, I contended with them and cursed them and beat some of them. So again, I'm not sure which, if those are the men, hopefully, or if he was doing that with the others. Hope not. But beat some of them and pulled out their hair, and I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. So I assume he's talking to the head of households, to the men. Did not King Solomon of Israel, which is again this classic, this is where this great king went wrong, sin on account of such women. Among the many nations, there was no king like him, and he was beloved by God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. So this great example or bad example. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? So point made. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, so again, this guy who had helped out Tobiah, now he was a son-in-law, we find out here, of Sanballat. If you remember, Sanballat and Tobiah were kind of the two bad guys. And I chased him away from me. And remember, again, Lord, I did this because he defiled the priesthood. So he was someone related to the high priest and yet was not all in terms of the worship of Yahweh. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So he kind of, that's the end of Nehemiah, kind of not a huge big end, but it kind of ends. These are all the things in chapter 13 that we should remember Nehemiah for. So any thoughts on that or questions about that? Yeah.
Just one comment.
Sure.
These are precisely some of the things that we read in the split. Reform church and interesting that it's on even to the day.
Mm-hmm. The big thing is how they, and this is what some scholars think, so it's not definitive, but that, what was that? Thought I heard something. Did someone else hear that? It's like the angels. But when they were in exile and they no longer had the temple, which was obviously central, at least for the people near Jerusalem, or the northern kingdoms, not so much. But in exile, because they didn't have a way of worshiping using sacrifice and that whole system, they became more focused on Torah. And so scripture became more important. And what we call today the synagogue really had its birth during that time. So roughly 2,500 years ago. And that was then their formation, as well as the home, which has always been important too. But then that helped them to know who they were, so that even when they came back to Jerusalem, and this time, around 500 BC, that was still they brought that with them, so that study of Torah and synagogues, especially outside of Jerusalem, became this way of them reinforcing who they were and what they believed about God. And then, of course, 500 and some odd years later, when the second temple was destroyed, then that was the final end of the sacrificial system. And so that structure of the synagogue and the importance of Torah helped to keep Jewish identity. And it also, even before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, those Jews in the diaspora that moved out through the whole Mediterranean and other parts of Europe and North Africa brought their faith with them through the Torah. And so that has always, for now, many hundreds, thousands of years have been what defined Judaism, even though a lot of the Bible is about the sacrifices, either the tabernacle before the temple or the temple. That's not a way of worshiping in their tradition anymore. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Well, mine was a comment, wasn't a question.
Yeah.
My comment was that Judaism split into different factions because of these things.
Sure.
That happened.
Right. And so what we know from the New Testament, the Sadducees, of course, were the kind of the temple gatekeepers. And then the Pharisees most commonly were known for their, connection to the law and the synagogue. And then you had what we would think of as almost monastic movements. So like the Essenes who went out into the desert and would pray and keep themselves pure. So you're right, there are factions. And then in more modern times, you have Orthodox, conservative, Reform. And those generally came from other issues over time in terms of how secular they were and how willing they were to kind of not be as strict in interpretation. Of course, yeah.
Indulgences or divorce.
Yeah.
Splits and why there's usually something that
Yeah.
creates such a conflict that we're not going to buy this and all this stuff. So,
Yeah, if you can't hear online, just that there are splits that happened during the time, around this time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then since with Judaism, what I was talking about. And then what Louise just said is how that also happened, of course, in Christianity, all the different splits. There's usually a historical event that is the catalyst, and then there's reaction to whatever the event was. And so for us, you have splits east, west in Christianity, Protestant, Catholic in Christianity. And then within Protestantism, more splits than there are hairs on a dog. So there's all sorts of splits, and some for good reason, perhaps, but most often for very human, not so good reasons. But that's part of our story.
I want to share just something.
And I should have my mic. Maybe I should use the handheld, but go ahead.
No, I wanted to mention that I've been sitting here, and I've had others have too, thinking about kind of the image of Nehemiah tossing furniture out, being righteously angry about
Right.
the law not being followed, and Jesus in the temple.
Right.
So this kind of bothered me because I see Nehemiah as kind of holding the edge a little bit with the violence, pulling out people's hair.
Yeah.
And striking them down.
Not ideal.
Jesus
Yeah.
didn't do that. He just flipped it and said, get me out of here. And
Right.
Let's have a temple that's holy and not surrounding money operation. But it got me thinking in the present day that there are a lot of us, I can feel righteous about something. There's a danger, in my opinion, about righteousness. Nehemiah was righteous.
Right.
Jesus was righteous. What's the difference? Jesus stopped at the door of not being unloving. He
Okay.
made a point, it was a strong point, he didn't hurt anyone. Right? Just said, so I'm thinking for me, when I feel righteous about something, which means I got an idea that I think other people should follow.
Right.
Whatever that is. I gotta stop at the door of kindness.
Right.
Still being a loving interaction. And that to me was important,
Yeah.
because we all think righteousness is a great thing,
Yeah.
right?
So let me repeat for online. I'm sorry we don't have the microphone. Hutch, do you know where the microphone is in the back or no? Or do any of you? It's on the drawers on the right. I don't know if anyone could, or Louise.
Where?
It's on that cabinet on the right. It's either the first or second drawer. And if we do the handheld, maybe I can use it and pass it around. Thank you. But that violence is kind of the stopping point. So Louise was making the comparison between Jesus and the cleansing of the temple, which is a famous scene in the Gospels, but also then comparing that with Nehemiah and what he did when he was righteously angry that Nehemiah, in Louise's point of view, crossed the line of violence and of using force, not only, like Jesus flipping the tables and the money lenders' treasures, but that he also used, thank you. Yeah, probably not. But that he didn't cross into hurting people physically, and apparently Nehemiah did, according to the story. He pulled hair and hit folks. So I guess if I'm restating it clearly, don't do that. So yeah, if you disagree with someone about whatever the hot issue is of today, don't hit them. I think we would agree with that as a clergy investor team. Any other thoughts or questions about Nehemiah? Yeah, Hutch.
I kind of looked at it in a larger biblical context. And those recurrent themes biblically, these assemblies, these renewals, I'm sure that throughout the Old Testament, that one at the end of Joshua comes to mind. this business of during King Josiah's reign, the reading of Deuteronomy, and even Nehemiah. And there's a commonality in what happens in this, that first there's remorse, and then there's repentance.
Right?
And ultimately, this leads to a purification process, renewal, recommitment. We see all this, and so in Ezra, Nehemiah, where is this taking Judaism? I thought about that, and to me, ultimately, in this, religiosity seemed to prevail over spiritual. In that, the outcome of all this is that, yes, Judaism as a religion purified itself, but in the spiritual sense, what this covenantal relationship between Jews and God supposed to accomplish, and what it was supposed to accomplish is Israel is to be a light to the nations, a light to the world. I sense from the outcome of all this, the wives, et cetera, that they close themselves off. And to overuse a metaphor, this wall almost becomes a metaphor for Judaism, rather than reaching out, has suddenly decided to close in.
Okay.
And so as a modern reader, and this is supposed to have a message to me, I think as a community, or nation, or individually, when we accept a religion, we really have to look at where is that religion taking me.
Sure.
And if this religious practice is not taking me away from my self-concern to concern about others, then perhaps this is not working as it should.
Okay.
Does your religious practice expand your heart, or does it contract it?
Yeah.
Are you more hospitable to others? I sense that this is, whether it's this church or me as an individual, or what's happening in Judaism several thousand years ago, that they missed the boat a little bit on this. And we should examine this and say, what is religion doing for me?
Yeah. No, that's a big reason we study scripture. And whether it's Judaism or Christianity, that's kind of a constant, that you have the prophet, whether it's Moses or Jesus and Paul, and they have this message from God. They bring good news, or they bring covenant. And then there's almost always, like you're saying, somewhere along the way we lose our way, and then there's the call back, and then the stories are kept for us, at least in part, as examples, right? So that we can look at Nehemiah and say, okay, how do we fit in our day today? What's similar? What's different? What do we need to do differently? What lessons do we not want to learn? And then, especially as Christians, how does that connect with our faith in following Christ? So, yeah, that's why we study scriptures, all these lessons. And hopefully by praying and studying them together and using good scholarship as resources, we learn stuff and don't go down, rabbit holes. There's rabbit holes there that can get us off track. But anyway, so that's all helpful. Any other thoughts about Judaism, or about Nehemiah, or about us today? I think we've learned enough on Ezra and Nehemiah. I assume somewhere in the next 20 years, I'll look at them again. But and I think they are good. I don't mean to say that. It sounds more dismissive than I mean. But Esther is a different type of story. It's similar in that it's a hero or heroine story. There's a star, and in this case, really two stars or examples, heroes that we'll read about. And then they're bad guys. So just like Sanballat and Tobiah with Nehemiah. So, it's basic, all the things you need for literature. It's more or less what's known as a court story, court, document or drama court, like the king's court and what's going on around the kings all the way through the Middle Ages. I mean, these are good stories because the king is important and usually has interesting people against him, and that whole good and evil, which are, usually themes in most stories, play out because who will get the king's attention and get him to do what's right. And so this is a court story in that sense. And then it's also the story of exile for the Jewish people in particular. And it's reminiscent of other similar stories where the Jewish people are somewhere and they're mistreated to some degree, whether an individual or as a group, but then God saves them and actually elevates one of them into a position of authority to help protect the people and hopefully do the right thing. Can you think of two other big stories that are similar, where there's someone in exile or someone who's been sent away from his people, but is able, because of God's grace, to do great good? Two big figures in the Old Testament.
Joseph's a biggie.
Yeah, so the Joseph story, some call it a novella. So in the Genesis story, basically the last third of Genesis, remember his story, what happened to him? His brothers hated him basically because he was his dad's favorite. Dad gave him a special coat and he was a little full of himself. And he ended up getting thrown in a pit. There are two versions of the story, but basically got sold into slavery. And then he was this great slave, and he was working for maybe the captain of guard. So he had this high position at one level already, and then Potiphar's wife, remember, she really liked Joseph. And a whole long story, he got thrown in jail again without going into all the Joseph story. So he gets sold by his brothers, thrown in jail, and then God still is able to bring him up because he can interpret dreams. So Joseph, the great dreamer, and he becomes more or less the prime minister of Egypt. And then his people, which at that time were really just an extended family, come into Egypt, and his role and all the bad that happened to him is used for good and protecting the people that God wanted to protect. Who's the other? So Joseph's a big one. Who's another story you may think of? Jacob, a little bit, because he goes with his in-laws, but not quite as dramatic. Daniel. So Daniel is a whole book, if you've read it. We haven't gotten it in this series of studies, but the whole first third, roughly, of Daniel is this similar type of story. Then it gets into more apocalyptic, prophetic parts of Daniel. But same type of thing. He's in exile, so it's a story about someone who makes a decision, even though he's probably a young leader from the Jewish people, and the king wants him to be, brought up to be a servant, at a high level. But because of that, they get food from the king's table, but it's not kosher. And so Daniel says, I don't want to eat any of that. I'm going to eat a simple kosher diet, which by doing that is an expression of faith. And he ends up being elevated. And again, without getting into all his story, his faith is rewarded, and he becomes again a leader to the king. So Esther is in that same genre. So that hero, it's written also, we don't know for sure, they didn't date their stuff, but we think, this time in Persia was somewhere in the, 500 to 400 period BCE or BC, that it was probably written sometime after that. Most people think somewhere between 400 and 300 for the time of Christ. So in that age period, because of one, there's not a lot of Greek references, and and Alexander the Great conquered that area. So it's probably before then. Persia's still this great empire. It's written while they're in exile, or if not in exile, still a large Jewish community in Persia. So even if it was during the time when some of the Jews, like with Ezra and Nehemiah, had returned, they were still present and very much involved, even at the highest level in Persia. It also is used by Jewish people for one of their feasts or holidays. Does anyone know the feast that is connected with Esther? You get extra points if you know. Purim. So you win. Has anyone ever been to a Purim? I went to a Purim service once at a synagogue, or what's one neat thing after the service you always get? food, but sweets in particular, get special sweets. But one of the rules with Purim is you have to read the whole scroll or book of Esther. So that's part of it. And some people don't know if the events led to the holiday or if the holiday inspired the need for a good story. So most scholars don't think it's a real historical story. It's a fictional story, but written to be read as history. So it has historical elements. But, for example, we think Ahasuerus, the king, who is kind of depicted as this dope, right? He's easily manipulated, not someone you'd want to follow in the battle, is probably a parody, a satire of Xerxes, who was this great king, and that the actual Xerxes is not like this guy, right? He's a great king, had one wife his whole life. He's actually pretty, for a pagan emperor, a pretty good example. But again, if you're in the oppressed minority, you make fun of the people over you, whether they're good leaders or not. You want to be sure in your own stories, they come out as kind of, if not stupid, not as great as they were in their public, power. And again, it's written to help the Jewish people in exile, because they've been in exile in Babylon and now in Persia. And then one reason it continues to be this popular story for so many years is because then even not in a true exile, but the diaspora, as they leave, what we think of as Palestine or Israel today and end up in Greece or end up in Italy or end up in North Africa and all over Europe eventually, that they want to learn how to live where they're a minority and where there's a greater culture. How do they live? What do they learn from this story as an ongoing lesson? So that's at least part of the overview. It also has some literary qualities. We won't go into a lot of that, but there's events that happen repeatedly in Esther. Has anyone read Esther in advance? Okay, so what is a social event that keeps happening? It kind of keeps the story moving. Starts with a B. A banquet. So they have a lot of banquets. It starts out with this huge banquet, which we'll get into when we read the first chapter. But then there are like 10 different banquets. And each one is pivotal in the story. So you read, oh, it's a banquet. Pay attention. Something's about to happen. Also, there are different characters that are more or less paired together. So, you have the king, obviously. You have Vashti, the first queen. You have Esther, the second queen. You have Mordecai, who's like the godfather or uncle. He's a Jewish man. You have Haman, who's a bad guy. So there are all these characters that are fairly well developed. For a short story, you get to know them and know a little bit from them. So that's another literary device. Also, it's very fast moving. If you ever heard someone teach on Mark, it's always moving. Same thing with Esther. There's not too much sitting around. Even the banquets, there's action going on. And then some have said that the prose is not particularly good prose. There's parts of it that feel clunky. But some scholars say that prose is written that way, especially when there are court documents, something from the king that they're trying to make it sound like official Persian language. So it may not be bad Hebrew or Aramaic. It may be that they're trying to accomplish something in the way they're writing, if that makes sense. And then there's also, in addition to the satire, a lot of hyperbole. That's an important thing to remember as we study the Bible. It's not, it's not a newspaper account. It actually is written for a purpose of exaggeration. So that first banquet, for example, for those who read ahead, like 180-day banquet. Well, has anyone ever been to a 180-day banquet? That's quite a banquet. So that is part of what was going on. Also, that when they have the replacement, they're selecting the replacement for Vashti, and we'll get into her a little bit as well, that the maidens that are selected to be the new queen go through a 1-year-long beautification process. So think of a year-long spa day. So, that's probably an exaggeration. And then at the end of the story, not to, spoiler alert, close your ears if you don't want to know, but when there is a great, they're trying to wipe out the Jewish people. When that doesn't happen, those who are slain, it's probably, again, an exaggerated number, like 75,000 are slain. So that is part of telling the story, making it, again, a better story and not necessarily literally true. In addition to some of the literary elements, one thing, what is unique as far as a theological view of Esther? What would you say is something that you may have read about or noticed in reading it? That's a good point. Scott said that the woman is the star, and they're not, not as many star stories for women, so that's very good. Yeah.
I read a very brief synopsis and was not very friendly towards it, but
Right.
the theological implication by this author was the Jews, love your kin, hate your enemy.
That is another part, especially Gentiles. So Esther is not always a well-loved story among Gentiles, Christians. So yeah, that's another part of it. I don't think there's anything, I'm almost positive, no chapter or verse of Esther is in the lectionary that we read on Sunday. I'm not sure about the daily office, I'd have to check. So that's two things. So it's kind of love your kin, hate your enemy, and also woman's the star. There's a third thing that's really big theologically.
They don't understand, hides her identity. She's,
Another big thing, you're right. That,
she's Jewish.
and that both Mordecai, her uncle or godfather, and Esther kind of do that as a strategy, is one way to look at it, to kind of get into the right position to help God's people. But also it could have been a symbol of being somewhat, assimilated. So, that's always a danger in exile, is do you keep your identity? But we still miss the biggest thing, and y'all just may not have noticed or read it. God's not mentioned in Esther. And so that obviously gets your attention. It's implied in a few places, but there's no, Yahweh did this, or Yahweh calls you to do this. And so that's unique. Now, there is some assumed providence because, the people are protected, and courageous Jews stand up and bring, in some sense, they're bringing God's will, but it isn't stated in that way. So that's a unique part. And that's why, again, some Christian theologians, like Martin Luther, for example, hated the book. I think Luther had some other issues, probably a little, like we all do, but that he didn't like the book. And others, more recent scholars, also just felt it wasn't a helpful book because of those things, kind of an anti, Gentile point of view, God not being mentioned, some of the other parts. But at the same time, I think it also, especially in the context of the Holocaust and other great pogroms in the last 200 years, I think it's a good counter to that, and how Gentile leaders, Christian or not, have done awful things. That Esther is this antidote of what do the Jewish people have to keep them together and to be protected, either by God or their own wits, their own courage. So that's at least part of it. Another thing, even though God is not directly identified, it is either you can interpret it as coincidences. These things keep happening, and they work out to the favor of Esther or Mordecai or God's people. But it's like hidden. It's not an obvious, like the stories of Moses or other biblical stories. It's definitely not. It's a lot more like you could read this as a secular story. It's, again, a difference. Another thing just to notice from a Christian point of view is Esther, I don't think I said this yet, is not quoted in the New Testament. So it's not in the Sunday lectionary. It's not quoted in the New Testament. It's one of those, I think, 8 or 9 Old Testament books that aren't quoted. Some are just real short, but some are not quoted at all. Esther is in that category. Some are quoted quite a bit, like you would imagine the Psalms or Isaiah. And again, like I said earlier, it's been criticized by Christian commentators. I don't know if this mic is helping more or hurting more, but it kind of pops in and out. So that's an overview, but what questions? Yeah, Ruth.
Did you, number one, say Esther is the star?
Yeah, which is what the name means literally. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But which I wasn't really making an intended
Like
pun.
the main character.
She is the main character. Yeah, that's what Scott said, is what's unusual about the book, at least outside of the Apocrypha. There are only 2 books, right, that are titled with a female lead. So Ruth, your namesake, and Esther. In the Apocrypha, there's Judith is another one. Trying to think if I'm forgetting any. I think those are all the ones I can think of. They're characters, individual judges or like Lady Wisdom. They're characters, and Mary, the Marys in the New Testament. But so they're characters in books, but in terms of the whole theme, Esther's the star. And again, Esther does mean star, so that's a little pun. What else? Yeah, Louise.
Just one question.
And I'm going to give you the mic because you have a
Um,
gentle voice. Pass it around.
tell my husband.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll clear this up rather quickly, because I didn't read it yet. And so the one point that you mentioned, God not being mentioned, of course, the challenging Louise starts looking through to see if she sees the name of God. And she does, because there's Esther's prayer and Mordecai's prayer. But I did also notice that those in my Bible are italicized, whereas the rest of the book is not. So can you explain?
And I bet you have a Catholic translation, right?
Yeah, I do.
So both Jewish and Christian folks were uncomfortable that God wasn't mentioned. And so in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, early on, people said, yeah, let's put a little God in here. So there are places in the original text where those prayers, like you mentioned, are added, and they kind of flow. So depending on your view of scripture, from an apocryphal point of view or deuterocanonical point of view, it's in there. From a strictly Protestant point of view, and we're, of course, we have a boat on the dock and on the boat as Anglicans, but that it's not in the original, so it was added.
Greek version?
Yeah, so the Greeks and then the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, like that edition because it has God in it, and that feels better, but it's not in the original.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's why I said, I don't know your translation, obviously, but
Yeah, it is. It's a-
but if it's italicized, it's probably a footnote explaining that it's,
Jerusalem Bible,
Yeah.
unless it is the-
yeah, because there's the original in Hebrew and Aramaic, and then there's those additions, usually, not always, but often came from the Greek, the Septuagint, which was the first real translation of the Hebrew.
That's actually why I picked it,
Yeah,
because it has more stuff, but this makes sense to me that
Yeah.
I'm not gonna pay as much attention to those prayers because they weren't original. And I can understand why they were put in.
yeah, and you can, yeah, and please pay attention to them. They're just in a different level of authority, I would say, and I think most church leaders would say. Doesn't mean they're not authoritative, but it's a little bit different. And to me, just from a literary point of view, it's kind of, I think, important to read the original story, and then you can add in the extra things that are more God-centered. I'm very God-centered, but it was written. The original author wrote it with a purpose, so it's good to know that purpose.
It's right here in my notes.
I'm not making stuff up. I know some stuff. What other thoughts or questions? Can you all hear me okay without the mic? I think the mic is more distracting. Yeah. But you can use it, Hutch. I know it's, you're the best heard, I hear from the online
I've got
people.
a Jerusalem Bible.
Yeah, we got all these ecumenical folks here. That's great.
You have brought in that the original Esther was written in Hebrew, but then embellished by Greek-speaking Jews in the Septuagint. So when we read this, and I'm trying to follow it in my Catholic Bible,
Yeah.
will my version be different than the one in the Protestant Bible? Because I assume the Protestant Bible will be based on the Hebrew writing.
Correct.
Mine will have elements of both.
Right. So if you have, a RSV or NRSV, if you want to do this, you can have them side by side and however you're comfortable reading it. Or is yours italicized as well, Hutch? If you're both reading the same one, it might be a different edition.
No.
Yours is
Probably has some type of, probably has a footnote, I would imagine, explaining it. Yeah. So, and again, the Bible is, God uses the Bible in all different ways in our hearts. So read it both ways, in the way just the nature of the history of translation and text, all the different texts. It's not a clear, perfect, linear thing. So there's been all sorts of changes over time, but those are two big ones. What other thoughts or questions? So you want to get in the story real quick? We'll just do the first little bit of chapter 1. We actually took a little more time than I was thinking, but that's good. Because the thing to remember, read it as a comedy, because it is. It's funny. So, whenever it's almost like once upon a time, this happened in the days of Ahasuerus. There is no Ahasuerus, but like I said earlier, I think it's probably referring to Xerxes, and they put another pseudonym on it. He was the one who ruled over 127 provinces. This is maybe a little exaggeration, but pretty close to history from India to Ethiopia. So that's also a similar area that Alexander conquered. He kind of conquered what was already a conquered region. And there were different capitals, such a large empire, different regional capitals. But in Susa was in one of those capitals that he was sitting there on his throne in the 3rd year of his reign, verse 3, and he gave a banquet for all of his officials and ministers, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors. So all the big shots were there. He displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So what I said earlier, a 6-month party. Kind of wonder, well, who was running things? If all these leaders are at a party for 6 months. But again, remember, this is a joke, or this is irony, satire. Then when these days were completed, hadn't done enough, the king gave for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, both great and small, a banquet. So again, for all the people. So, let the party continue. This one was only 7 days, because there's a lot more people. And this was in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And then it describes, it's real pretty, all the different hangings and curtains and so forth. A very rich place. Drinks were served, all different types of drinks were served. Verse 8, drinking was by flagons without restraints. They're drinking hard. For the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each one desired. So have at it, boys, Animal House. Furthermore, Queen Vashti had her own banquet, and it was separate. So it was for the women. And so that was going on. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, so it kind of sounds like, King Henry or someone. He commanded these officials, the 7 eunuchs, so they would typically be those responsible for the women, for some obvious reasons, to bring Queen Vashti. So have the queen come to the king. And we'll learn later in the story, when the king calls you, you're supposed to come. To come before the king wearing the royal crown in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused. So that's the beginning of feminism. So somewhere 2,500 years ago, the queen said, yeah, you're a drunk old man and all your officials are drunk and I don't like how this is going to turn out. So I ain't coming. She refused to come to the king's command. And at this, the king was enraged. Is anyone surprised? And his anger burned within him. Verse 13. So the king consults his advisors who knew the law, because the queen had power, right? And we don't, again, there's no record of the Queen Vashti, but often, a king and a queen are married for dynastic reasons. So she may have been, in this story, the daughter of some great noble. So, you can't just do something, not easily. So they went and checked the law. What was the custom? What can you do when your queen doesn't listen to you? And so they consulted all the great resources. Verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of the king? And then this advisor says in verse 16, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials, everybody that was present. She's kind of insulted all of them and all the peoples, because remember, this was a party with all the people who are in the provinces of the king. Verse 17, for this deed of the queen will be made known to all women. Now, this is kind of funny. This is almost like a Greek play at this point. This is going to be made known, causing these women to look with contempt on their husbands. So she has started a bad precedent. And this is, we got to, nip it in the bud. We got to stop this because that's going to be a problem. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. So that was obviously an issue. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. So again, this has kind of a modern feel to it, that this many feminist theologians see Vashti as this great hero. Esther is a little more ambivalent. There's good and bad, at least in that critique, according to that critique. Verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal order, this is kind of, think of this as, I think, funny. Let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king, assuming he's still kind of buzzed, and the officials and the king did as his advisor proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. So again, that is interesting because remember, it's being written as satire. So at least in part, it makes this king, and I think by extension, a lot of men look foolish. That Vashti was probably, this is reading into the lines, making a good decision. And yet, because it hurt the king's ego, he does this great reaction. Now that's the catalyst for the story. And then Esther is going to come in as a replacement queen. But just stopping there, because it's right at 11, a little bit after. Any just first comments? Yes.
I'd like to say my experience with Purim is that it's a festival for children.
Right.
And one of my children would attend, and it was when they were very young. The girls would dress up like Queen Esther. They would all dance around, and nobody took the whole story very seriously.
Right.
And it's interesting because what I got out of reading it, it's a story of that there is nobody insignificant in the world of saving groups.
Okay.
In other words, Esther saved the Jewish people that were being condemned.
Right.
And I think that's the overall picture. That
Right.
Not the details, but the idea there's no such thing as an insignificant person in saving others. And in this case, it's a woman.
Right. So if you couldn't hear online, Judy was saying there's no one insignificant in God's, or in the saving of God's people, that there is all different folks. And in this case of Esther, a woman who's brought into a place for just such a time as this, which is a famous line from Esther, that she was raised up and was courageous and wise and able to save the people. And, some of the details, like a lot of the Bible, okay, we'll just kind of put that part over here. But the good part of the story from our point of view is that heroic action. Any other thoughts or questions? I know we're past time. We'll pick up then with chapter 2 next week. And if you think of any questions from chapter 1, bring those with you. And again, thank you everybody for being online and being here in person. God bless you.